It began with silence, a silence so dense it felt like the city itself was bracing for impact. From the battered ramparts of Constantinople, smoke curled on the horizon, and with it came drums. Ottoman drums, slow, heavy, announcing not just an army, but an ending. Why does this siege matter more than any other? Because it wasn't just a fight for land. It was the final breath of a world order, the last heartbeat of Rome itself. Not a collapse over years, but over minutes, over moments. This was no ordinary conquest. It was a transformation engineered by Mehmed II, a 21-year-old sultan who didn't just bring cannons, but conviction. He wasn't merely a warlord. He was a man with a manuscript, rewriting the fate of empires with fire and steel. And here's the question no one dares ask. What if Constantinople was already dead before the first cannon fired? Imagine watching your legacy decay from within, stone by stone, law by law, generation by generation. The Byzantines didn't just lose to iron, they lost to entropy, they lost to time. Because every empire falls, but some expire. While the defenders stood by doctrines, Mehmed flowed like water, adapting, evolving, striking where it hurt most. He didn't see a city, he saw a symbol. And symbols, when shattered, echo across centuries. Clausewitz once said, "War is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument." Mehmed understood this intimately. His goal wasn't destruction, it was rebirth. He didn't want to erase Constantinople. He wanted to resurrect it under a different name, under a different god. But inside those walls, time had slowed. Every Byzantine decision echoed a failed one. Every movement felt like a delay. They weren't planning anymore. They were enduring. And that quiet dread, that knowledge of inevitable fall, was perhaps Mehmed's greatest weapon. Because this wasn't just about breaking stone. It was about cracking identity. Over the next few minutes, you'll see how the empire's defenses unraveled through politics, betrayal, and steel. How a boy sultan broke the world's longest surviving empire. And how the fall of one city didn't just redraw maps. It redrew meaning. So let's begin. But remember, the real breach wasn't in the walls. It was in the will to believe they still mattered. The walls of Constantinople weren't just stone. They were belief. A belief so deeply etched into the minds of its rulers that it blinded them. To many inside, those towering defenses, some dating back to the Secolo Quinto, seemed eternal, impenetrable, as if sheer age had given them immortality. But that illusion, that fatal overconfidence, was precisely where the fall began. Picture it, April 1453. The air is thick with dust and tension. The sun scorches the Theodosian walls, stone giants that stretch for over 6 kilometers, standing like the last ribs of a dying empire. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI, Paleologus, leans over a cracked, sun-faded map. His fingers pause on worn-out ink, tracing old lines with the weight that feels heavier than war. Around him, generals whisper in low voices, men who have seen more retreat than victory, more cracks than triumph. Their armor clanks, but their faith, fragile. They point to gates, they revise positions, they repeat tactics carved generations ago, strategies meant for another era, another enemy. There's loyalty in their eyes, but also something else, fatigue. The kind that lives in empires on borrowed time. Meanwhile, just beyond the hills of Thrace, a storm was taking shape. But this one didn't bring thunder. It brought cannons and a 21-year-old sultan with no intention of repeating history. Mehmed II wasn't reading old scrolls, he was redefining siege warfare. That was the misread. The Byzantines prepared for the wrong war. They believed they could outlast, that the walls would buy them time, that Europe would answer their pleas. But what they failed to grasp was that time wasn't on their side. It was on Mehmed's. His cannons, cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban, didn't just threaten stone, they threatened time itself. Every blast from those monstrous bombards rewrote centuries of military assumptions in an instant. There's a letter written by a Venetian merchant stranded in the city during the siege that reads, "It is as if thunder itself is knocking at our gate, and with every roar, the city forgets what it once was." That's not fear, it's realization. Realization that doctrine had become dogma. Mehmed understood what Clausewitz would later articulate, that no plan survives contact with reality. That's what he weaponized, friction. The Byzantines relied on fixed schedules, on routine patrols, on familiarity with terrain they thought would always be theirs. Mehmed disrupted all of it. He didn't just fire cannons, he shifted tempo. And that tempo shattered the rhythm of a dying empire. Inside the city, bread lines grew longer. Water became precious, not because supplies were instantly scarce, but because command structures cracked. Orders delayed by internal bickering. Disputes between Latin mercenaries and Greek commanders. Mistrust as thick as the stone under their feet. But let's zoom in for a moment. One of the city's outer bastions, near the gate of St. Romanus, had been left under the control of a minor officer, Nikitas, son of a blacksmith. His orders were clear: hold the line. But what do you do when the line begins to shake? When cannon fire collapses a section of wall you were told was unbreachable? When the cries of your men are drowned out by iron and fire? Nikitas didn't retreat, he improvised, salvaging beams, creating temporary palisades, lighting signal fires to warn of breaches. His bravery was unquestionable, but it wasn't enough, because no matter how much courage you have, if the command above you is locked in tradition while the enemy adapts, you're already outflanked. Strategically, the Byzantines had placed all their faith in static defense. But Mehmed was mobile, psychological, and precise. He knew the city better than they did. He had maps drawn from travelers, spies, defectors. He didn't see walls. He saw pressure points, weakness disguised as heritage. Even their sacred institutions played against them. Every day without victory was a reminder that divine favor might no longer reside in Constantinople. Priests held processions, but their prayers echoed in half-empty cathedrals. Faith, once a shield, became a question. Let's not forget the geography either. The land walls faced west, but the Ottoman army had surrounded the city in a crescent. The Byzantines could see the enemy, but not predict him. The Golden Horn, long considered a natural barrier, was now a potential gateway. But that maneuver, we'll get there soon. For now, remember this: strategy isn't just about weapons or walls. It's about timing, reading your opponent, and knowing when your own doctrines have expired. And in 1453, as thunder echoed off stone, the Byzantines kept turning to old maps, while Mehmed was already rewriting the future. He was 21, just 21, while the emperors of the West were debating inheritance and indulgences. Mehmed II was laying the foundations of an empire. And he didn't do it with brute force alone. He did it with vision, with a strategist's mind and a poet's hunger for legacy. On the plains outside Constantinople, while the city clung to the ghosts of the Roman world, Mehmed was already 3 steps ahead. mentally mapping how to suffocate not just the city's defenses, but its very identity. Let's pull the curtain back. April 1453. The Ottoman camp spanned miles, a mosaic of tents, workshops, stables, and artillery positions. At its heart, beneath the blood-red banner fluttering in the Thracian wind, stood Mehmed's command tent. From there, he orchestrated not just an assault, but a performance, a calculated campaign of psychological dismantling. One of his generals, Zaganos Pasha, often said the Sultan didn't speak of battle like a warrior, he spoke of it like an architect. Every cannon position was intentional, every delay a feint, every message intercepted by the Byzantines, carefully scripted. And then there was the Golden Horn. For centuries, the Byzantines had trusted this inlet like a moat. Guarded by a massive chain and the fleet of Genoese ships, it was a natural defense that had turned back sieges before. But Mehmed didn't see an obstacle, he saw an opportunity to turn the chessboard. On the night of April 21st, under cover of darkness and the rhythmic beat of drums that masked their work, Ottoman engineers and soldiers began dragging ships overland. They laid greased logs across the Galata hills and pulled dozens of warships overland like oxen carts. The people of Constantinople awoke to an impossible sight: Turkish ships floating behind the chain inside the Golden Horn. That was the moment morale cracked. Imagine the horror. Walls facing west, defenses designed for land assault, and suddenly the enemy was behind you, without warning, without precedent. How do you defend a city when the rules of war no longer apply? It was more than a tactical breakthrough. It was a collapse of mental certainty. That chain across the horn, it wasn't just metal, it was belief. And now, it was irrelevant. Mehmed weaponized surprise. There is a passage from the Byzantine chronicler Ducas describing this moment. The people of the city stood upon the walls and wept, for the sea had turned against them. That's not just emotion, it's capitulation. But Mehmed didn't stop there. He understood that brute force alone wasn't enough. His bombardment, while relentless, was paired with silence. Days would pass with no attack, then nights filled with sudden cannon fire. Sleep was rationed, fear wasn't an accident. It was part of the plan. Even inside his army, Mehmed curated discipline. The Janissaries, his elite corps, weren't just warriors, they were symbols. Trained from childhood, loyal to him only. When they marched, they didn't chant, they didn't speak. They moved like shadows with steel. And the Byzantines watched. One soldier, a young Greek named Manuel, wrote in a letter later found in the ruins of his home, "They didn't run. They didn't shout. They stared, as if we were already defeated." Psychology became a spear sharper than any blade. And as the days passed, the Ottomans didn't just attack walls, they attacked coherence. Whispers of betrayal, letters intercepted and altered, rumors that Genoese ships had abandoned them, false flags planted within the city. It wasn't just Sun Tzu's lesson, divide when the enemy is united. It was Mehmed's embodiment of it. He fractured the city from within without ever stepping inside. And while the Byzantine commanders argued over prayer rituals, defensive rotations, and dwindling supplies, Mehmed rewrote the art of siege warfare. Not with more troops, but with smarter positioning, better rhythm, and a narrative of inevitability. He wasn't merely conquering Constantinople, he was replacing it. And as every day passed, the city resisted less because of lack of stone or swords, but because the man outside their gates refused to fight like the ones they'd prepared for. So ask yourself, What do you do when the enemy doesn't break your walls, but your certainty? May 1453. The wind carried more than dust through the battered alleys of Constantinople. It carried doubt. Not just the kind that gnaws at morale, but the kind that corrodes foundations. Because while Mehmed's cannons roared outside the Theodosian walls, a quieter war was being lost inside them. Let's start with logistics. At first glance, the city seemed prepared. Warehouses filled, wells deep, weapons stacked. But that was illusion. The empire, once sprawling from the Nile to the Danube, had been reduced to this single jewel, and the jewel was cracked. Trade routes long severed, grain convoys intercepted. What reached the city came in trickles, not caravans. And the worst part? They knew it. Inside the walls, quartermasters juggled dwindling inventories. The dockside granaries near the Golden Horn, once bustling with merchant activity, stood silent. Rats and rumors multiplied. Priests prayed louder. Civilians lined up for loaves that never arrived. And when food falters, unity follows. The defenders were a fragile patchwork. Greek regulars, Latin mercenaries, remnants of Genoese fleets. Brave, yes, but splintered. The Genoese commander Giustinali, a seasoned warrior from Chios, held command over a critical section of the land wall, but his loyalty lay more in honor than in empire. His authority clashed often with native Byzantine officers, some of whom still viewed the Latins as foreign occupiers, not allies. And that's the tragedy. They weren't just fighting an external siege, they were navigating an internal minefield of pride, language, and mistrust. The Orthodox Catholic schism hung like smoke over every decision. In the Hagia Sophia, priests debated rituals, while outside, engineers patched walls with whatever they could find: scrap timber, loose stones, even furniture from nearby homes. There's a chilling entry in the Chronicle of George Frances, Emperor Constantine XI's close advisor. He writes, "We fasted, not in devotion, but necessity. We prayed not for victory, but for mercy." That line, bare, resigned, reveals more than any map or statistic. But perhaps the greatest blind spot was hope. Hope weaponized, a belief that the West would come, that the Pope's promises weren't just words sent on sea winds. Constantine XI had staked political capital and precious time on the idea that Venetian ships or a papal fleet would arrive on the horizon, that a crusade could still be mustered in time to raise the siege. But Rome was distracted. Florence debated art, Paris mended treaties, and Venice, ever the traitor, weighed profit against piety. When aid came, it was too little, too late, and split in allegiance. Inside the walls, the waiting turned into despair. A young soldier named Andronicus, just 17, stood watch on the northern bastion. His diary, found decades later buried beneath rubble, reads, "We saw sails. We cheered. Then they passed." That line, 5 words that captured an entire empire's final gasp. What happens when your last strategy is a prayer? And all the while, disease crept in, not in waves, but in shadows. Open wounds from cannon blasts turned septic, wells poisoned by runoff. The stench of rotting livestock seeped into the stone. Constantinople wasn't just starving, it was rotting from within. And that's the irony. The empire didn't just fall to iron and fire, it fell because it couldn't see its own cracks. The real enemy wasn't just Mehmed, it was inertia. A failure to adapt, to unify, to let go of the idea that the old walls and old alliances would somehow, miraculously, hold just one more time. But in war, blind spots are fatal. especially when they're not on the battlefield, but in the heart. It was a move no one believed was possible, because it had never been done, and that's precisely why it worked. Late April 1453, the sky above Constantinople was bruised gray. The rain had stopped, but the mud clung to everything. Soldiers trudged along the walls, their armor caked, their eyes heavy. Inside the command chamber, Emperor Constantine XI reviewed the sea defenses. The Golden Horn, calm, glinting like a blade, seemed untouchable. This inlet was more than water. It was the city's shield. On one side, the massive iron chain, thick as a tree trunk, stretching from the walls of Constantinople to the Genoese colony of Galata. On the other, a fleet of Christian ships, mostly Genoese and Venetian, standing vigil like loyal hounds. Nothing could pass. That's what they believed. And that's precisely why it worked. He studied the harbor like a surgeon, not as a barrier, but as a pressure point. While his land cannons pummeled the western walls, he was plotting something else entirely. A maneuver so audacious it bordered on madness. He would bring his navy over land. Using greased logs, oxen, and manpower, Ottoman engineers, led by the tireless and brilliant Ishak Pasha, a satrap of the Anatolian frontier, began constructing a path through the hills of Galata. It was a logistical nightmare. Steep terrain, unpredictable soil, constant risk of sabotage. But Mehmed didn't flinch. He pushed harder. A Venetian observer, Niccolo Barbaros, wrote in his diary, "It was like watching mountains move. Ships slid across the hills as if summoned by some spell." No metaphor could truly capture what this meant, because Constantinople's defenders had never planned for imagination. On the night of April 21st, as the city slept, the ships began their silent march. Dozens of galleys and smaller vessels, some fitted with light cannons, were hauled across the hills under torchlight. The logs beneath them screeched, the ropes strained, but the work never stopped. Not for rain, not for mud, not for disbelief. And at dawn, horror. From the towers of the Blakarne Palace, a Byzantine scout looked east and froze. Turkish ships, dozens of them floating inside the Golden Horn, past the chain, behind their line. Panic followed like fire through dry grass. Because this wasn't just a breach of defense, it was a breach of reality. A space that had always been safe suddenly violated. The harbor that once offered sanctuary now whispered death. Commanders scrambled. The Genoese Admiral Trevisano tried to reposition ships. Greek Marines repositioned ballista. But it was chaos. And Mehmed, he didn't even need to strike immediately. The damage was psychological. The Byzantines were now surrounded. Nowhere was safe. This move flipped the chessboard. Even the defenders on the land side began doubting. If they can bring ships over mountains, one officer muttered, what can't they do? Fear, once contained in the night, now lingered through the daylight. But Mehmed wasn't finished. He began constructing floating platforms, small mobile artillery bases inside the Horn. Every day they drifted closer to the seawalls. Every day the city lost another breath. Urban's great cannon may have shattered stone, but this maneuver shattered certainty. And behind this brilliance lay another layer. By diverting attention to the Horn, Mehmed thinned the defenses on the land side without firing a shot. Constantine had to pull troops, shift patrols, reroute supplies. It was a slow bleed, a distraction engineered with surgical intent. It was more than strategy. It was theater. Even Sun Tzu, writing centuries earlier, had warned, appear at points the enemy must hasten to defend. March swiftly to places where you are not expected. Mehmed didn't quote the text, he embodied it. A young Byzantine archer, Marcos, stationed near the harbor bastion, recalled in his letters, "We didn't fight them. We watched them. We watched as the sea became theirs." Because in that moment, it wasn't ships or chains or cannons that decided the balance. It was imagination. And Mehmed's was unstoppable. Can a leader hold a city together with just courage when everything else is falling apart? By the end of April, the physical toll on Constantinople was visible. Cracks ran through its walls, but deeper fractures ran through its leadership. The once golden capital, now cloaked in ash and anxiety, was being held together more by ritual than reason. And at the center of it all stood Constantine XI. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a symbol, a remnant of a lineage that traced itself back to Rome. But symbols, however noble, don't give clear orders when chaos knocks. Constantine, bound by honor, by legacy, refused to negotiate with Mehmed. Even when advisors begged him to consider terms, even when food was gone and hope thinner than the walls he walked daily, he held the line. But was it strategy or pride? The people saw his resolve. His soldiers admired his presence at the front. But inside the palaces, the cracks widened. Constantine could no longer command like a general. The noise of internal dissent drowned out his orders. He relied on messengers, some too afraid, some too slow, and his word became whispers lost in the storm. Leadership, once strong, became isolated. One man who witnessed this firsthand was Stephanos, a clerk stationed at the imperial armory near the Sea of Marmara. He recorded in his journal, now preserved in fragments at Mount Athos, how one night no orders came for the night watch. The officers debated for hours, quote, "His Majesty cannot be disturbed," unquote. So the gates remained unreinforced. And when the eastern wind carried strange noises across the sea that night, none dared investigate. They were paralyzed, not by fear of the enemy, but by fear of doing the wrong thing without imperial approval. The emperor's shadow had grown so large that even action required permission. And in siege, hesitation is death. Meanwhile, inside the barracks, morale teetered. You could hear it in the silence after a command, the hesitancy in drawing weapons, the refusal of some guards to climb the towers twice in a single day, not out of laziness, but out of emotional depletion. There was a janitor named Leon who served at the monastery of Christ Pantocrator. He wasn't a soldier, just a man who carried water and swept blood. When the monastery bell failed one dawn, no one came to check. He waited, then walked alone across the garden, found 3 guards asleep, not from negligence, but exhaustion. He wrote, quote, "I didn't wake them, because for the first time, I didn't believe we'd see the sun twice," unquote. That kind of fatigue, it eats strategy alive. Mehmed, meanwhile, kept pressure constant. Artillery bombardments increased at irregular hours, not just to damage walls, but to prevent rest. His commanders, such as Isaac Pasha of the Rumelia satrapy, reported nightly shifts in assault patterns. Ottoman drums echoed unpredictably. Fires were lit near the southern walls, only to vanish moments later. Shadows danced across the water. Noise became a weapon. Victor Davis Hanson once wrote, quote, "War exposes the true mental readiness of a culture," unquote. And Constantinople, for all its spiritual resilience, had no more mental reserve. The people were hollowing out, quietly, invisibly, from within. By May, the outer towers near the gate of St. Romanus began to lean, not just physically, symbolically. Constantine still walked the battlements, still showed his face, but eyes no longer followed him with the same reverence. They followed out of habit. In war, that is a fatal shift. And the real tragedy? Constantine wasn't a failed leader. He was the last man standing in a city that had stopped listening. What happens when your final hope sails in the wrong direction? For months, Constantine XI had held firm to a belief that had outlived its usefulness, that the West would come, that reinforcements from Christian Europe would appear on the horizon like divine justice in the form of Venetian galleys and papal banners. But the truth? The truth was slower and much colder. The Pope had promised assistance, Venice had pledged ships, Genoa had agreed to mobilize, yet every promise was tethered to diplomacy, debate, delay. A war council in Rome, a hesitation in Naples, political squabbling in Avignon, and by the time the sails did appear, they were few, fractured, and far too late. The reliance on the West became a kind of strategic blindness, as if faith in others had replaced readiness within. Inside the city, hope was rationed like bread. "They will come," said the priests. "They must come," echoed commanders. But May arrived and the sea remained silent. The Genoese captain Giovanni Longo, stationed near the old docks, described the mood in his private journal. "We look out each morning as if salvation rides the tide, but every sunrise burns that illusion a little more." And while the Byzantines stared westward, Mehmed built eastward. The Ottomans were not waiting, they were moving. Satrap Yahya Bey of Karazi was tasked with overseeing the southern approaches to the sea walls, ensuring that even if a fleet broke through the Dardanelles, it would find no safe harbor. His men fortified coastal batteries, built makeshift naval platforms, and spread word among the Ottoman ranks. "If ships come, we will burn them." But they didn't need to, because the ships barely left their own ports. Why? Religious division, for one. The schism between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity had not just weakened ecclesiastical unity, it sabotaged strategic trust. Western powers hesitated to risk men and resources for a city they viewed as spiritually alien. Some in Venice whispered that a fallen Constantinople might open new trade opportunities with the Ottomans. Better Mehmed than a rival bishop? And still, Constantine waited. He wrote desperate letters, sent envoys by sea, and every reply was the same: soon. But war does not wait for diplomacy. One of the most tragic tales came from a young messenger named Petros, who had sailed to Chios for a plea for help. He returned only with a scroll bearing vague assurances from the papal nuncio. Petros died 2 days later, struck by shrapnel as he delivered the letter to the imperial palace. The scroll was never read aloud, not because of its content, but because no one in that moment believed it mattered anymore. What does it cost to fight with borrowed will? The answer was etched into every broken gate, every unmanned tower, every delayed decision made in the hope that someone else, somewhere else, would change the tide. Clausewitz warned, a war is not waged with the resources of the enemy. And yet that is what Byzantium attempted. To delay with borrowed time, to defend with external promises. By mid-May, even the whispers of aid had grown still. No sails on the horizon, no thunder of distant drums, only the constant, growing beat of Ottoman war machines. And so the city fought on, alone, not just outnumbered, but abandoned. Not just surrounded, but betrayed by its own illusions. What happens when the very thing you trust most becomes the first thing that fails you? For centuries, the walls of Constantinople were more than stone. They were legend. Triple-layered, towering and over 12 meters high in some sections, with a moat deep enough to swallow cavalry whole, they had defied Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and time itself. But by May of 1453, they weren't just under attack. They were telling a dangerous lie. The belief that those walls were impenetrable was so deeply embedded in the Byzantine psyche, it blurred strategy. The city's defense had become architecture rather than adaptation. But walls don't think, and they certainly don't evolve. Mehmed knew this. He didn't just aim his cannons at stone, he aimed them at belief. Each shot was a message: this city is not invincible. And eventually, the walls began to believe it too. Urban's cannon, the basilica, was positioned near the valley of the Lycus. Its roar was felt in the bones of defenders stationed at the gate of St. Romanus. On May 6th, a deep fracture appeared along the outer layer. It didn't collapse, not yet, but it shook. The ground trembled, the air filled with the sharp tang of burnt powder and crumbled lime. Inside the towers, defenders scrambled to repair by torchlight. They used anything: timber from abandoned homes, iron scrap, even icons stripped from chapels. A monk named Alexios, once a scribe at the monastery of St. George, was seen carrying mortar on his back alongside soldiers, his robes torn, face smeared with dust. "If the wall falls, then let it fall knowing I touched it last." But bravery cannot patch centuries of erosion. Ottoman engineers, led by Ibrahim Aga from the satrapy of Sivas, began tunneling beneath the outer curtain wall, quietly, slowly. Every night, under the cover of cannon fire and feigned assaults elsewhere, they drove forward. These weren't just mines, they were wedges aimed at the city's heartbeat. One night, near the gate of Carisius, a tunnel collapsed. Not theirs, the Byzantines. A counter-tunnel hastily dug to intercept Mehmed's engineers fell in on itself. 5 men died. No time to retrieve the bodies. No strength to dig again. And still, the myth of the wall held firm in the minds of those above. That's what made it deadly. Sun Tzu warned, when walls are too high, the minds behind them fall asleep. He didn't mean complacency. He meant the illusion of security, that false sense of control. Constantinople wasn't just defended by bricks, it was trapped by them. As the Ottomans escalated pressure, siege towers crept closer under the veil of night. New trenches emerged like veins, feeding the assault. The moat, once formidable, had partially dried up in the warmer days of May. Without proper irrigation, it became a basin of dusts, and Mehmed's men moved through it with terrifying ease. Justiniani, still commanding the Genoese contingent, begged Constantine to deploy mobile reserves, archers, crossbowmen, even reserves of Greek fire. But hesitation prevailed. Every bold action risked thinning another front. The wall had become a crutch, a reason not to risk, and so the defense remained static while the assault evolved. In the southern sector, near the Zwilikirkos Gate, Ottoman sappers planted charges beneath the tower base. The resulting blast didn't collapse it, but it shattered morale. Dust, screams, and a thunderous crack that felt like the earth itself groaning. A boy named Mikhail, barely 13, was in that tower delivering water to wounded men. When the blast came, he ran blindly through the rubble. Later, in a letter recovered from a ruined home, he wrote, "The wall screamed louder than the men, and I knew then the city had no voice left." So, what is a wall, really? It's not just stone, it's faith in continuity. But when it begins to fall, it drags everything with it: strategy, morale, leadership, and hope. And by mid-May of 1453, The walls of Constantinople were no longer symbols of endurance. They were tombstones, waiting for names. What if the loudest weapon in a war isn't a cannon, but silence? By mid-May, the siege of Constantinople had turned into something more than a military confrontation. It had become a theater of the mind. Steel clashed, stones shattered walls, but what Mehmed unleashed next was quieter and far more lethal. He turned fear into a tactic. Every night, the rhythm changed. Some evenings, the drums of the Janissaries rolled like thunder across the hills, echoing against the inner walls of the city. Other nights, there was only silence, complete, deliberate, deafening. Soldiers on the battlements would lean into the dark, desperate to hear something, anything. But silence has a weight. It starts to stretch the nerves. The Ottomans knew this. They began sending patrols to approach the walls with no torches, no sound, whispers of movement, a shift of gravel, a distant creak of leather armor. The defenders never knew if it was an attack or a game. One night, a unit led by satrap Ismail Bey from Kastamonu staged a mock assault along the southern wall. Dozens of men moved in formation under cover of fog. They lit fires far behind their lines, made it look like preparations for a full-scale assault, but they never advanced. The Byzantines responded by shifting critical reserves, and hours later, the Ottomans hit the weakened gate of St. Romanus. They didn't need to win the fight. They only needed the defenders to flinch. And flinch they did. Inside the city, rumors spread like smoke that Galata had fallen, that Ottoman ships had breached the Horn again, that the emperor had fled in disguise. None were true. But in siege, truth becomes less important than belief. A merchant named Leontius, once wealthy, now reduced to delivering food to towers, wrote in his diary, "I saw a man stab his friend for whispering that the walls had been breached, not because he believed it, but because he feared what the others would do if they did." Fear wasn't just emotional, it became structural. Inside the monasteries, monks stopped singing during the night hours. The sound had once been spiritual comfort. Now it was a risk. One echo, one mistaken chant could draw attention from the Ottomans beyond. Even sleep was no longer safe. Mehmed ordered catapults and bombards to fire intermittently, not in waves, but in sporadic, calculated intervals. The aim was not to breach the wall, but to deny the defenders rest. Sleep deprivation was now a form of siege. A letter from a Genoese soldier, Paolo de Salvo, described how one of his comrades tried to strangle a bird perched above his post. He said it was mocking him, that it had learned the beat of the drums, that it knew when the next strike would come. These weren't isolated breakdowns, they were accumulating. And beneath it all, fear metastasized into betrayal. Reports surfaced of guards abandoning posts. Some left gates open not for sabotage, but because they simply forgot to lock them. Others claimed visions, angels leaving the city, or shadows speaking in Turkish, hallucinations born from exhaustion. Beaver said it clearly: morale, once lost, is more lethal than any weapon. By late May, the defenders were not a single army. They were fragments of faith. Some holding swords, others clutching relics. Their hands shook the same. And Mehmed, he watched, not with cruelty, but with calculation. He didn't need to crush them all at once. He just needed the fear to do what his cannons had not: break them from the inside. When does a battlefield stop being land and become a legend? By the final week of May, Constantinople was no longer just a military target. It had become an idea, a decaying empire on the edge of myth. The Ottomans weren't just breaking through walls anymore. They were rewriting history, and Mehmed knew it. Strategically, the city still had pockets of resistance. Some towers held, some streets remained fortified. But psychologically, the city had begun to surrender long before the final charge. Constantinople wasn't simply the capital of a crumbling state. It was the last whisper of Rome, a direct line, unbroken, bruised but breathing, from Caesar to Constantine. To lose it wasn't just to concede territory. It was to watch an entire civilizational arc fall silent. And that silence echoed loudest in Mehmed's vision. He didn't hide his ambitions. Chroniclers close to his court, like Tursun Beg, recorded how the Sultan spoke not of conquest, but of destiny. "I will enter as Caesar," he once declared before his inner circle. And it wasn't vanity. It was branding, deliberate, pointed, symbolic warfare. He would not just take the city, he would become it. To reinforce this, Mehmed's forces left nothing to chance. Maps were redrawn. The final stages of encirclement were choreographed with surgical precision. Commanders like Zaganos Pasha tightened pressure near the gate of Tiresias, while Satrap Kara Murad oversaw logistics along the southern flanks, ensuring food, water, and firepower flowed without pause. But even in those final days, the symbolism outweighed the logistics. There's a story from the monastery of the Theotokos Pamakeristos. A scribe named Andronikos reported seeing a boy no older than 10 sweeping icons into a cloth. Not stealing, preserving. "If they take the city, I want to bury these like seeds. Maybe they'll grow back later." That's what was really dying. Not the buildings, not the battlements, but an identity. A vision of the world that had placed Constantinople at its center, politically, spiritually, eternally. Mehmed didn't destroy that vision, he absorbed it. When his cannons roared, it wasn't just to breach, it was to proclaim, "The old order ends here." He even began preparing the narrative before the siege was over. His scribes were ordered to draft proclamations to Islamic courts and Christian rivals alike. Statements that didn't speak of plunder, but of order, of stewardship, of a new Rome. This wasn't just military brilliance, it was psychological domination, strategic redefinition. As Little Arts once said, strategy is the art of distributing and applying military means to fulfill the ends of policy. And Mehmed's policy was never limited to borders. It was about legacy. The Byzantines, meanwhile, could feel this. The mood shifted from defense to elegy. Songs turned into laments. Walls weren't repaired, they were mourned. Even Emperor Constantine stopped speaking of victory. His council transcripts from May 26th show no mention of counterattack or reinforcement, only last stand, only duty. And in that shift, the war ended, not with a final blow, but with a final identity. Constantinople ceased to be a city under siege. It became a symbol in transition. The gates still stood, the towers still held, but the empire behind them had already vanished.
What do you do when your enemy has more men, more firepower, and time on their side? The final days of the siege laid bare a truth the walls could no longer hide. Constantinople was outnumbered, outgunned, and outpaced. Yet the defenders still stood. not because they believed they could win, but because they couldn't afford not to. On paper, the inequalities were stark. Mehmed's force numbered over 80,000, a blend of seasoned Janissaries, Anatolian levies, Balkan vassals, and auxiliary units under satrapal command, like the contingent of satrap Qasim Bey from Aydin, who oversaw the rear siege logistics and replenishment lines from a journey to the camp. In contrast, Constantine's forces barely scraped 7,000. That included Genoese mercenaries under Giustiniani, a handful of Venetian sailors, and a mix of citizens, monks, and boys too young to know they were about to die. But war isn't math, it's movement, and movement is where the Ottomans thrived. They shifted troops daily. Mehmed never allowed his units to grow static. Vanguard formations rotated. Night Watch changed patterns. Janissaries trained in silence, rehearsing final assaults with surgical precision. Their lines breathed. Byzantine formations, by contrast, became brittle. Every man had 3 tasks: patrol, guard, repair. No rest, no reserves, and with each breach or artillery strike, the gaps widened, not just in stone, but in stamina. One moment reveals the contrast perfectly. On May 26th, a dust storm rolled in from the west, cloaking the land in a choking veil. It was the kind of weather that equalized sightlines. Giustiniani saw it as an opportunity. He ordered a surprise sortie from the gate of St. Romanus. 120 men, a mix of Genoese crossbowmen and local infantry. They made it across the moat, hit the Ottoman siege lines hard, and almost broke through. Almost, because the Ottomans had drilled for this. Within minutes, a Janissary reserve unit under Subazi Hüseyin Pasha flanked the attackers. Arrows came from above, spearmen encircled. By the time Giustiniani called retreat, over half his men lay bleeding in the dust. The sortie wasn't a failure of courage, it was a failure of elasticity. The Byzantines had no depth, no fallback, no backup plan. Even the terrain, once their greatest ally, now turned on them. The valleys west of the city, especially near the Lycus, had once funneled enemy troops into narrow kill zones. But the Ottomans had learned. They leveled slopes with dirt and timber, created platforms, turned the geography into scaffolding for their siege towers. What had once protected the city now gave Mehmed a ladder, and he climbed. But numbers alone didn't win the war. It was mindset. The Ottomans adapted daily, relentlessly. They evolved from brutes, besiegers, to choreographers of conquest. The Byzantines repeated. They recycled strategies from past glories, believing history would save them. But history, like walls, doesn't hold forever. And the soldiers felt it. A Greek archer named Demetrius, stationed near the Golden Horn, recorded in a torn scrap of parchment, "We have more ghosts than men now. I shoot arrows not to kill, but to remind the city I still breathe." That kind of resilience, it's not easily measured, but it's often all that stands between a soldier and surrender. Glantz wrote that in siege warfare, will is often more decisive than resources. And for a time, the Byzantines had will in spades. But will burns fast, and when you're surrounded by an army with fresh fuel, endless reserves, and a leader who dreams in empires, you begin to understand that sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about not vanishing without a sound.
What does the last heartbeat of an empire sound like? On the night of May 28, 1453, Constantinople held its breath. The stars were veiled, torches flickered against cracked marble, and inside Hagia Sophia, a strange stillness reigned. Not the quiet of peace, but the hush before extinction. Emperor Constantine XI Pelagius, no longer wearing his crown, stood beneath mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. He took communion with his men, soldiers, nobles, street vendors turned defenders. No decrees, no speeches, just a whispered farewell. He would fight, not as a ruler, but as one of them. Then he vanished into the night. Outside the walls, Mehmed's machine stirred. The siege had reached its crescendo. Over 80,000 Ottoman troops now surrounded the city like a tightening noose. 3 waves, 3 hours, 1 goal. Break the wall, flood the breach, take the city before dawn. First came the irregulars, Anatolian conscripts, loosely armed but burning with belief. They stormed the moat, their chants drowning in the clash of steel and stone. They were meant to die, and they did, by the hundreds. Their purpose? Exhaust the defenders, blunt their swords, empty their quivers. Then came the second wave, the regional auxiliaries. More trained, better armed. They attacked with siege ladders and battering rams. They pressed against the weakened gate of St. Romanus. And there, in the chaos, Constantine himself fought, sword drawn, armor dented, bloodied. He repelled wave after wave, shoulder to shoulder with Genoese, Greeks, even monks wielding axes meant for wood. But it was the third wave that cracked the world open. The Janissaries, elite, silent, choreographed in columns, led by commanders like Subashi Hussein and Karanja Bey. They advanced, not with rage, but with certainty. At Mehmed's signal, they surged toward the inner breach, and they found it. A section near the Kirkoporta gate accidentally left ajar, a mistake, a sliver. But in war, a sliver is a sentence. They entered, quietly at first, then a flood. Inside the city, panic erupted. Bells rang, fires spread, streets turned into slaughter fields. Emperor Constantine vanished in the melee. His body was never found, though a corpse later identified by imperial purple was dragged before Mehmed. The emperor had died fighting, the empire with him. At dawn, Mehmed entered the city, not as a conqueror in rage, but as a ruler in ritual. He rode to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, entered. And there, beneath crumbling domes and shattered glass, he claimed the soul of the city. A chronicler wrote, "He stood in silence, then knelt and whispered a verse, not of victory, but of permanence." Because Mehmed didn't just win a battle, he closed an era. What happens when an empire vanishes before breakfast? When the sun rose over Constantinople on May 29, 1453, it didn't rise over a city. It rose over a wound, raw, smoking, and wide open. The Byzantines were gone, not exiled, not imprisoned, gone. Not even the Romans had ended like this. They had fractured, they had splintered. But here, it was like someone had blown out a candle that had burned for over 1,000 years. The Ottomans didn't just inherit a city, they inherited a ghost. And Mehmed, still just 21, understood what he held. He didn't gloat, he didn't torch the city. He walked it, slowly, street by street, watching the silence, smelling the smoke, listening to what was left. He entered Hagia Sophia again, this time not as a warrior, but as a restorer. And in a moment that reshaped history, he transformed it, from cathedral to mosque, from empire to empire. Not by erasing, but by absorbing. That was Mehmed's genius. He didn't raise Constantinople, he rewired it. Within months, he ordered repairs to aqueducts, opened bazaars, and invited displaced Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to return.
He wanted Constantinople alive, not as Byzantium's tomb, but as the Ottoman heart. The city would be renamed Constantinia and later Istanbul. But its bones, its alleys, its domes, its rhythms, they remained. This wasn't just a change of flags. It was an empire reset. The political chessboard had been flipped. Europe reeled. Venice mourned its lost trading partner. The papacy scrambled for a crusade that never came. Eastern Christendom fractured permanently. Russia soon crowned itself the Third Rome, but it was a pale echo. The Second Rome had fallen with finality. But what about those who lived it? We know of Janus, a baker who had survived the siege by hiding in a wine cellar with his son. He emerged 3 days later and wept in the ashes of his bakery. Years later, under Ottoman rule, he reopened it, now baking bread for janissaries instead of Byzantine monks. History isn't made in palaces, it's made in stories like his. And it's there, in those ashes, in those lives, that Mehmed rebuilt his empire. Not just through war, but through rhythm, through routine, through administration. He appointed Maud Pasha as Grand Vizier, delegated the reconstruction to capable satraps like Isa ibn Bey of Aydin, and revived trade routes through the Golden Horn. Taxes were recalibrated, laws restructured. He merged Islamic governance with remnants of Roman bureaucracy. Even his enemies knew this wasn't just a conqueror, it was a new order. So what really fell that day? An empire? Yes, but also a worldview, a rhythm, a memory of Rome's eastern breath. And what rose in its place wasn't just the Ottoman Empire. It was a new center of gravity, and its heart beat from Istanbul.
It wasn't just brick and stone that crumbled on May 29, 1453. It was memory, it was myth, it was the last wall of Rome. That massive wall, the Theodosian Wall, had held the world together for nearly a millennium, and when it fell, something ancient, something irreplaceable, dissolved into dust. Do you feel it? That echo still trembles in the bones of cities today. But what exactly did that wall protect? Not just Constantinople, not just a Byzantine capital. It guarded a worldview, one rooted in continuity, sacred monarchy, imperial lineage. It had outlived the Caesars, the Goths, the Crusaders, yet in a single coordinated strike, led by a young Ottoman sultan with vision deeper than steel and cannons larger than dreams, it was breached. And nothing, not even the Renaissance blooming in Florence, would ever be the same again. Let's pause here. Not with a battle, not with a map, but with a name. Lucas Notaris. He was the last Megas Deus, the Grand Admiral of Byzantium, a man of letters and of the sea. On the final day, he watched his world burn from a palace balcony. He was captured, spared, and then executed along with his son. His last words, as recorded by Frances, whisper through time. It would have been better to be ruled by the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Latin. Striking, isn't it? In that single line, we glimpse the entire trauma of Byzantium. They feared the West's betrayal more than the East's conquest, and in a tragic twist, that dread came true. But let's pull the camera back. Geopolitically, the fall of Constantinople reset the map. Trade routes shifted. The Silk Road became vulnerable. Venice's supremacy was challenged. Portugal turned westward and Spain followed. Just 40 years later, Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Would he have done so if Constantinople had held? Probably not. The ripple of a cannonball on Roman walls echoed across oceans. And culturally, the exodus of Byzantine scholars into Italy infused Europe with ancient Greek texts, catalyzing the Renaissance. The fall didn't extinguish knowledge, it scattered it like sparks across a country ready to ignite. Even militarily, this was an inflection point. The use of siege artillery, the logistical orchestration of a cross-continental army, the naval blockades, it all became blueprint. Future sieges, Vienna, Rhodes, Malta, would be measured against what Mehmed achieved in 53 days. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the silence. The silence where Latin once rang through the Hagia Sophia. The silence of cloisters turned to minarets. The silence in Europe's courts where kings and popes debated vengeance, but chose delay. And today, when we walk those walls, still standing, battered, patched, they don't whisper of empires. They ask a single, aching question. What do we do when history collapses in front of us? Do we rebuild? Do we adapt? Or do we remember? The fall of Constantinople wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of 1,000 others. Tales of migration, reinvention, resilience. From the ashes of Byzantium came the soul of Istanbul. From shattered faith, new identities. From broken walls, bridges. And so we close not with sorrow, but with a call to learn from fallen worlds, to listen to the echoes, and never, ever forget that even the strongest wall is only as enduring as the memory it protects. That was Constantinople. That was 1453. That was the wall that broke the world.